Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rick Garnett. I'm on the faculty here at the law school, and I'm the faculty director of the Church, State, and Society program that is sponsoring this first annual Rice Hasson Distinguished Lecture. I have the great privilege and pleasure, and I guess here at Notre Dame, we're allowed to say blessing. So I have the blessing of being able to welcome a lecturer who's one of my heroes to give a talk that is named after several of my heroes. And that is a fun thing to be able to do. The Church, State, and Society program is nested within the broader Religious Liberty Initiative here at Notre Dame, which my friend Dean Marcus Cole, from whom you'll hear in a minute, has launched. And this is an exciting initiative. And one of the things it's designed to do is to bring the good news to the world about the dignity of every human person. And that it's because every person enjoys human dignity and is made in the image and likeness of God, that every person possesses the right to religious freedom. And it's fitting that this lecture, the Rice Hasson Lecture, is named for three tireless champions of both religious freedom and human dignity. First, my former colleague, Charles Rice. He was a Marine, a prolific author, a legendary teacher, and mentor for decades here at Notre Dame Law School. I'm personally grateful to him because he referred all of my children to his son for pediatric care. And he was a tireless advocate for the dignity of every human person, especially the most vulnerable among us. And then the lecture is also named for Mary and Seamus Hasson. Mary Hasson is the Cato Byrne Fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, and she directs the Catholic Women's Forum. And Kevin Seamus Hasson is a quadruple domer, holds 4 degrees from the University of Notre Dame, including most recently an honorary degree. And he is the founder, president, and really the inspiration behind the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, which has been an inspiration for so many of us who try to labor in these fields. I should also say, for better or worse, Seamus Hasson is the first person who recruited me 24 years ago to Notre Dame Law School. So give him credit or blame for that as you will. And then finally, just for now, this lecture is made possible by the generosity and the benefaction of 2 friends of mine, Thomas and Mara Lehrman, who are here. They're both longtime friends of Notre Dame and of the work of the Becket Fund. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing another friend, my colleague and dean, Marcus Cole. Although Notre Dame tried to recruit him to our faculty several decades ago, he decided to go to this place called Stanford because it was sunny. But good things come to those who wait, and Notre Dame was willing to wait. And so we were able to bring him back to Notre Dame as our dean in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Marcus Cole, who will introduce our distinguished lecturer.
Thank you all so very much for being here. I was saying to someone this morning that this is such a special place that we've just this semester welcomed 3 Supreme Court justices who graced our halls. But I have to tell you that I right now have goosebumps because someone who's a hero of mine is about to speak to you. I have followed Mary Ann Glendon's career since I was an associate at Mayor Brown, where the partners in the firm were relentless in telling me how she was the greatest associate they've ever had in the firm and that you will never fill those shoes. I think my feet are actually bigger than hers, but those are very big shoes indeed to fill. She has long been my hero. Ambassador Mary Ann Glendon is the Learned Hand Professor of Law Emerita at Harvard University, and she's the former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, where she represented the United States before the Pope and the Vatican. She is one of the world's leading scholars and voices in areas of human rights, comparative law, and political theory, and she's been a tireless advocate for human dignity and the fundamental right to life. Ambassador Glendon served as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. In 2019, she was appointed to chair the U.S. State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, and she received the National Humanities Medal in 2006. In 1991, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she was president of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences from 2003 to 2013. She's been a member of the Board of Supervisors of the Vatican Bank from 2013 to 2018 and represented the Holy See at various conferences, including the 1995 UN Women's Conference in Beijing, where she headed the Vatican delegation. Ambassador Glendon has published countless books and articles, including A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, A Nation Under Lawyers, The Transformation of Family Law, which, by the way, was the winner of the Legal Academy's highest honor, the Order of the Coif Triennial Book Award, and Abortion and Divorce in Western Law, the winner of the Scribes Book Award for best writing on a legal subject. And she's also wrote the leading textbook on comparative law entitled Comparative Legal Traditions. It's a great honor and my sincere pleasure to welcome, and I hope you will join me in welcoming, Ambassador Marianne Glendon.
Thank you, Dean Cole, for that very generous and kind introduction. I am more excited and honored than I can say to be giving this lecture named for three people whose work and life and example has been such an inspiration to me and to countless other people, and whose work and lives have left and are still leaving a great mark on the culture transformation that we're all trying to affect in these United States. So I'm grateful to Notre Dame for choosing me to give this talk. When I first got the invitation, I was wondering how I was going to do justice to the diverse contributions of three such different but amazing individuals. And the thought that came to me, and the theme of these remarks, is that they were and are environmentalists of a very particular sort. Now, don't go away. I'm using that term in the way that Popes John Paul II and Pope Francis used the term human ecology, the sense of social environments, those institutions that Catholic social thought speaks of as mediating structures of civil society, intermediate institutions. And I will be speculating about how changes in human ecology, social environments have affected the legal profession and the vocation of law. So that's my title, Human Ecology and the Legal Vocation. I'll be asking you to think about changing environments and what our role as lawyers is in trying to shift probabilities in a good direction. So as you see, as far back as 1991, St. Pope John Paul II was saying some pretty amazing things. He said that we should be at least as, he says, even more worried about what's happening to our social environments as we are, and he said rightly are, what's happening in the natural environments. And then more recently, Pope Francis echoed that call in an interesting conference, by the way, complementarity between man and woman. That should be better known. So Pope Francis speaks now of a human ecological crisis in these environments, a crisis that is entirely man-made. And he says it's essential that we foster a new human ecology and move it forward. So I think those calls are particularly relevant to the legal profession. Some of you may know the famous definition of the legal profession that was uttered about a century ago by a constitutional lawyer named Thomas Reed Powell. It was a definition of the legal mind. And he said, the legal mind is a mind that can think of something that is inextricably connected to something else without thinking about what it's connected to. I thought that was a joke, but one day I was talking to a colleague who specializes in free speech law, First Amendment free speech law, and I said, how come you never wrote anything about the religion language in the First Amendment? And said he, I am like the surgeon who drapes the patient with a white sheet, only leaving the little opening so he can focus on the thing that has to be fixed. And I said, well, maybe that definition, maybe Thomas Reed Powell wasn't kidding. In any event, by contrast, the work of our three honorees, each of their work is a model of thinking in a very lawyer-like way, thinking about what has to be thought about, but never losing sight of everything that it is connected to, and most importantly, the culture. Because after all, what we lawyers do in the realm of religious freedom only opens up space for cultural change. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But all three of our honorees were distinguished by seeing early warning signs, long before other people, of worrisome changes in the social environment. And they were among the first to perceive that the dangers were not only to individuals, but actually to the very foundations of our American democratic experiment. So, Charlie Rice. Charlie Rice was one of the few people who recognized way back in the 1960s that the gradual expansion of the abortion license would not only lead to the loss of millions of lives, but that it would foster a culture where life at its frail beginnings and endings was increasingly cheap. A culture where the taking of unborn lives would be regarded as a right, even to the point of countenancing forms of infanticide. A culture where a pregnant woman would be at often the worst crisis of her life, where she would be left alone with her rights. A culture where euthanasia would be promoted in the name of a right to die. And in 1969, 4 years before Roe versus Wade, Charlie Rice explained all this in a prescient book called The Vanishing Right to Life. Very few people were thinking that way. Now, my friend, Seamus Hasson, was one of the few people who perceived back in the 1990s that attacks on religious liberty were entering a bold new phase, and that they would escalate into a full-blown onslaught on the first of freedoms. And in 1994, Seamus left a wonderful career at one of the country's very best law firms. He left Williams and Connolly with Mary's support, and he put out into the deep. He really put out into the deep. He founded the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. And today, you may think of the Becket Fund, now Becket Law, as a powerful machine, a mighty defender of religious liberty. But back then, what a risk, what an incredible risk Seamus took, and what courage on the part of Seamus and Mary to take that risk. And on a personal note, I just have to say, thank you, Seamus, for dragging me into that movement in the 1990s and for giving me a small part to play in the Becket Fund. God bless you. Now, with hindsight, we all know that the onslaught on religious freedom was part of deeper transformations that were taking place in our society. And Mary Hasson was one of the few people who saw, back when Bob Dylan was telling us something is happening and you don't know what it is. Mary Hasson knew what it was. She knew it was a revolution that was taking place, a revolution in ideas and behavior that was transforming the relations between the sexes, that was unsettling a wide array of culture shaping social institutions, families, schools, religious groups, neighborhoods, workplaces. It was a long march through the institutions of American society and through the public moral culture that sustained those institutions as well as embodied them. There was a prescient essay by a Notre Dame graduate, a man named William Pfaff, who was a wonderful writer. And he summed up so beautifully how disarray in even one of those social institutions had ripple effects on all the others. And this was an essay in the New Yorker magazine. I'm going to quote. He said, "I have a chilling sense of the fraying of the web of connections between people at many critical intersections. Each fraying connection accelerates the other. A break in one connection, such as attachment to a stable community, puts pressure on other connections. Marriage, the relationship between parents and children, religious affiliation, a feeling of connection with the past, and even citizenship, that sense of membership in a large community, which grows best when it's grounded in membership in a small one." That's the end of the quotation. In a vicious spiral, the institutions of civil society could no longer count on assistance from volunteers from families, and thus families no longer could count so much on the institutions of civil society. And there we were. And complicating the situation was the fact that we have to admit this, many of those developments that have had such an ecological effect, many of those developments really were advances for many people. They were positive goods for many people in society, and they were welcomed in the years when they were taking place, but without realizing the cost. They had costs and they had casualties, and especially where the family is concerned, those costs and casualties fell very heavily on children. Now, I think that led a number of prescient people, like our honorees, to a new appreciation of what Tocqueville observed when he came here in 1831. He said that these intermediate institutions of civil society are pillars of our American democratic experiment. So this is why I think this term ecology is so important. They're pillars of the American democratic experiment in a couple of ways. They aid freedom by providing buffers between the individual and the state. And they also, very importantly, serve as seed beds of the qualities in citizens that are necessary to sustain a form of government that, after all, was an experiment. And our founders said it's an experiment that for its maintenance requires certain qualities of character and competence in the citizens, more than any other form of government. So that's heavy stuff. With that in mind, I'd like to offer a few thoughts about the work of the Rice Hassons as it pertains to what we now call faith-based institutions in our American mix of public and private approaches to problems. In the early years of our republic, the federal government was hardly involved at all in health, education, and welfare. And even during the Depression, when the federal government had to step in, took major steps into the area of poverty relief, President Roosevelt told Congress, in his 1935 State of the Union message, he told Congress that in the days before the Great Depression, he recognized all of those needs were supplied by local efforts. Counties, towns, cities. And he emphasized, this is the first time he emphasized it, but he repeated it in many other speeches over the following years. He emphasized It's my thought that after this economic crisis, these needs should be cared for as they were before. You might be very surprised, Professor Garnett, you might be very surprised to learn that essential to his vision was the role of religious and other private providers of social services. Just to show you that I'm not making that up, I want to call your attention here to the part where he says, every community and every state must first do its share. Out of this picture, we are developing an unselfish partnership between great church and private social service agencies and the agencies of government itself. Now, he gave a couple of reasons why he thought that partnership between church and state. Did you ever hear that expression before, the unselfish partnership? So he gave a couple of reasons why he thought that this was something that had to be maintained in the future. He says, no governmental organization in all history has been able to keep the human touch to the same extent as church and private effort. Government can do a great many things better than private associations, but in the last analysis, success in this kind of personal work in which you are engaged depends upon personal contact between neighbor and neighbor. And then he gave another reason. He said, the people of the United States still recognize, and I believe recognize with a firmer faith than ever before, that spiritual values count in the long run more than material values. That's Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. Eleanor Roosevelt, who differed with her husband on many things, fully shared his views on the importance of faith-based institutions. So she wrote in an essay at the height of the New Deal, she insisted that government alone could not provide a solution to the nation's complex social ills. Private providers of social services, religious and charitable associations, she said, quoting here, are able to do many things the state cannot do. Government has undertaken the responsibility of seeing that people shall not starve, but there are things other than food that are necessary to make life worth living. Many agencies have developed in this country because most of us believe we should help each other. We cannot let our charitable agencies suffer, and we must not let them go. Now, she was very aware of American distinctiveness in the matter of poverty relief. And she attributed that to its deep roots in the biblical strand of our political tradition. So she wrote a little book in the 1940s called The Moral Basis of Democracy. And if you look in her biographies, you will hardly find any biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that even mentions this book. I can't imagine why, but maybe this has something to do with it. So in this book, she says, the principle of the responsibility of the individual for the well-being of his neighbors is akin to love thy neighbor as thyself in the New Testament. That has always been part of the American democratic ideal, and that has differentiated our ideal from all other forms of government. Now, you might be wondering, that unselfish partnership, what happened? We're not seeing that. Well, if any of you are Professor Garnett students, you know what happened is that a Supreme Court majority in the 1940s had other ideas. And while the Roosevelts, the very same years when the Roosevelts were promoting their idea of unselfish partnership between church and state, and while many such unselfish partnerships were flourishing in communities around the United States. I think of the school case where the Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic parents organized, they used school premises and organized their own their catechism classes. No, Supreme Court says, no good. So almost any government cooperation between with religious agencies became vulnerable to attack, and the court began treating religious freedom as a legal concession from government rather than as a fundamental constitutional right, which is something like, well, you could say about those decisions, what Mark Twain once said. He criticized the fact that many preachers condemned the devil without giving him a fair trial or a chance to be heard. And he said, that is un-American. That is un-English. That is French. So with hindsight, we can see the makings of a perfect storm for religious freedom. The series of Supreme Court decisions weakening faith-based institutions, a series of ill-conceived federal programs that ignored FDR's vision of subsidiarity. I'll use that word as a shorthand, and programs that often aggravated the very problems that they were meant to address. And then the cultural revolution that diminished the capacity of the family to serve as society's first line social safety net and diminished the capacity of mediating institutions to step in when the family needed it. And here's where someone like Tocqueville would ask, I think, questions like this. What does the current state of our seedbeds of civic virtues portend for our nation's economic, social, and religious well-being? Is the United States producing enough citizens with the qualities of character and competence needed to sustain a constitutional republic? And here's where our three social environmentalists come in. All three of them devoted their professional lives to protecting the ecology of the supports of our democratic experiment. And there's not time to list, I mean, so many different contributions in different ways from the three, but for the sake of economy of time, I want to talk about a few of the heroic achievements of the Becket Fund. Becket is undefeated in the Supreme Court. It has a 95% win rate in federal courts since 1994. And it has 9 Supreme Court great victories, of which 5 were unanimous. Some of the most important of these cases concern the schools, public and private, that play such a large role in shaping the beliefs and comportment of the boys and girls who represent our future. I imagine that many of you, like me, got a pretty good education in public schools. But today, in my home state of Massachusetts, more and more parents are children in the public schools, including my grandchildren. They're finding that their children are subjected to relentless, one-sided indoctrination on matters such as sex, marriage, race, religion, and politics, and precious little formation and understanding the principles of our form of government. I noticed that even in first-year law students. So lately, I've come to a real appreciation of the chapter in John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty that nobody reads, the last chapter. People stop before they get to that. But it's quite astonishing to see how he was thinking way back in the 19th century. He says, a general state education is a mere contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. And as the mold in which it casts them is that which pleases the predominant power in the government, if successful, it establishes a despotism over the mind, leading by natural tendency to one over the body. Wow. And he got that phrase, you know, John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville actually knew each other and corresponded. And he got that phrase, despotism over the mind, from Tocqueville, and how it leads from one thing to another, to a more sinister, even more sinister. In fact, I think they both got it from Montesquieu, but I digress. Let's see. Okay. What are parents to do? What are parents to do when it is so difficult to provide our children with an education outside the public schools? And even if they manage to do so, they may find what Attorney General Barr spoke of when he was here last year, that a number of states are pressuring even religious schools to adhere to secular orthodoxy on many matters, or else be excluded from public programs. Barr called those developments the greatest challenge to religious liberty today. I'm not sure I would say that's the greatest, but we have plenty to choose from if we want to talk about about great challenges. And against that background, Becket Law has patiently litigated and won a series of cases that one by one, brick by brick, as Mark Rienzi likes to say, one by one, are leading to the demise of the infamous state constitutional amendments that stood in the way for so long for school choice programs and vouchers and tax credits. And at the same time, Becket lawyers have succeeded in increasing the rights of religious schools to govern themselves and to maintain their distinctive identity. These are remarkable victories. An enormous credit for them must go to the farsightedness of Seamus Hasson and to the great skill of Becket's lawyers. Mention should also be made of Becket's continuing efforts in favor of the rights of churches, synagogues, temples, foster care and adoption services, homeless shelters, to be true to what they are while they are doing what they are called to do. Like religious schools, these groups too are under constant pressure to compromise. In effect, they're being asked to give up the very qualities that enable them to do what they do best. That is, to coin a phrase, taking the savor from the salt and the leaven from the bread. And if I may quote one of the lesser known sayings of Bernard Lonergan, it's like taking the whiskey out of the highball. A striking example of how irrational these policies can get is the decision of a number of cities like Philadelphia to demand that religious adoption and foster care agencies either forsake their religious commitments regarding marriage or abandon their calling to provide services to needy children. Right now in this country, there are over 400,000 children in foster care. And the number is rising rapidly. And it's rising so rapidly that social service agencies are not finding enough foster homes for all of these children. The opioid crisis apparently is playing a role in this. So a recent Becket case shows how bizarre some of the city's behavior has been. The city of Philadelphia, in a single week, issued an urgent call for more foster families. And at the same time, a few days later, told Catholic social services that they either have to place children with whatever homes the city determines, or else they have to close down. Now, just around the time when all that was happening, I was listening to a story on public radio about the shortage of foster homes and about the especially heart-wrenching circumstances of special needs kids who, because foster homes were not available, were being put in mental institutions. And so I listened and I thought, well, what are they going to say about the fact that there are agencies that actually have shown special skill and expertise in providing homes for special needs kids? And those homes were being threatened in places like Philadelphia, but they never got to that. In any case, thankfully, Becket won a unanimous Supreme Court decision on behalf of the homes in Philadelphia. But here's my question about that, and maybe you'll have some thoughts on this. What about all the places, including my home city of Boston, what about all the places that when they were asked to compromise their beliefs, they didn't fight back? They just closed up shop. Or what about the places that said, okay, if that's what we have to do, that's what we'll do. That caused my thoughts to turn to bold Sir Robin, who boldly ran away. I think that it's a question we have to ask ourselves as lawyers. I said earlier, what lawyers can do is clear the space, but the space has to be occupied by somebody. What should we do? Maybe not as lawyers, but just as Catholics. What should we do to see that people do what the foster homes in Philadelphia did and hire the Becket Fund? Okay, so the struggle ahead. Seamus saw a long time ago that the opponents of religious freedom we're going to be relentless. Richard Garnett has told us that many of these cases, and I completely agree with this, many of these cases that involve conflict between religious freedom and something else, some other good like non-discrimination, they can be worked out through accommodation. Accommodation is possible in many of them, but the most diligent opponents of religious freedom do not want accommodation. And Mark Rienzi has written about this. He says they don't want accommodation. They want to drive us out of our jobs, undermine our institutions, close down our businesses. So this is serious business. I have a colleague, constitutional lawyer, who published the comment along these lines: the culture wars are over. And the only question remaining is how to treat the losers. And maybe the way to think about that, said he, is treat them the way we treated the Germans and the Japanese after World War II. Just tell them, you lost it, live with it. So fortunately, he was a little premature in his prediction about the culture wars. But in fact, Beckett's victories have greatly improved the chances for the survival of some very important ideas. One of them is the need to protect social environments we've been discussing. The other is the idea that faith-based institutions, education, healthcare, and social services can often be delivered more efficiently, more humanely, more effectively through the mediating structures of civil society than they can by government and acting directly. And here we have a wonderful passage from Pope Benedict's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, where he says, and I'm going to supplement what he says here, or quote a further passage. He says, there's no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. To treat assistance to the suffering as the exclusive province of the state, he says, demeans recipients by reducing them to problems rather than persons. He specifically warned against the common European tendency to regard charity as merely a social service and to look to the state as its primary supplier. Now, except for the Pope's more ecclesiastical language, what he says here is very similar to what FDR said in the 1930s. The state that would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself, would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy incapable of guaranteeing the very thing the suffering person, every person, needs, namely love and personal concern. Now, having praised Beckett's efforts and our honorees' efforts on behalf of the social environment, I must conclude with a few more words about the limits of law. It's easy when celebrating victories like the great victories Beckett has achieved, it's easy to forget that the ultimate fate of religious freedom depends on more than courts and legislatures. It's only natural for those of us who are lawyers to hope that our legal and political efforts will carry the day, but we all know that the best efforts of lawyers are no substitute for cultural support, the area where Rice Hasson works so effectively. Fortunately, there's some good news. I can't end without some good news. There's some great news coming from a recent study, the Religious Freedom Index. I have always said, I'll tell you what I have always thought the greatest threat to religious liberty was, the difficulty of convincing people that it's important. To me, that would be the number one. And I've also thought, and your survey helps me on this, I've also thought that that difficulty was getting greater because of the ever larger proportion of nuns and non-affiliated regarding religion in the population, because it's pretty hard to convince people that something is very important if it doesn't affect them or they don't perceive it as affecting them personally. So the Religious Freedom poll that just came out reveals that there is more support for robust religious liberty protection than people like me have commonly supposed. The principal findings are, these are very encouraging. Nearly 2/3 of Americans believe that religious organizations should be eligible on the same terms as non-religious organizations to receive government funds for providing social services. Over 2/3 support freedom of religious organizations to make leadership and hiring decisions without government interference. And even larger majorities support the right of religious individuals and groups to be free of discrimination on the basis of their belief that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. So on that encouraging note, I'd like to close with a few words. I think there are a lot of students here, and I'd like to say a few words about young men and women who are studying law here at Notre Dame. I've spent many years reading law school applications, and there is one phrase that more than any other appears on those applications. You know what it is? I want to make a difference. Right? And many of you probably wrote that on your applications. And I'm sitting in my office reading that. Here's what I wish I could say to those young men and women. It is, the awful truth is you will make a difference. And the real question is, what kind of difference will you make? Because every day with every act and every decision you make, you are constituting yourself. And so I think it's really great that they all want to make a difference, but I really hope they're thinking about the difficulties with that idea. So I'd like to close by passing on to you a wonderful saying. This is another saying from Bernard Lonergan. It's not about whiskey this time. This one is from his reflection on the difficulty of living as we all are amidst intellectual turmoil and the breakdown of the certainties that attend periods of cultural turmoil. And he says, here it is. There's bound to be a solid right that is determined to live in a world that no longer exists. And there's bound to be a scattered left, captivated by now this, now that new development, exploring now this, now that new possibility. But what will count is a perhaps not numerous center, big enough to be at home in both the old and the new, painstakingly enough to work out the transitions one by one. And it's in that not numerous center where Charlie, Seamus, and Mary have lived their legal vocations so amazingly. And that's where I pray that you will find yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We've got time for questions, which is great. And as we usually do at events like this, we particularly welcome questions from students. But having said that, I'm going to cheat. That's mine first. I'm really intrigued by this parallel you were drawing between ecological questions and some of these cultural ones. And it struck me that when you read the writings of John Muir or Teddy Roosevelt, when they were first trying to get Americans to buy into the importance of the national parks and conservation, one of the things they had to sell people on was that even people who were living in cities and might not see these places had a stake in the conservation efforts that those parks represented. And it strikes me that one of the challenges in the religious freedom context, especially because we are seeing a rise in the number of people who are unaffiliated, is convincing people who are not themselves religious believers that they nonetheless have a stake in a robust legal regime that protects religious freedom. So, just a few minutes. How do we do that?
Well, of course, whoever finds the magic formula, it will be wonderful. But there are certain points that I think we have to do better. We have to work harder to get across. And one is that it does affect one of the pillars that hold up the democratic experiment. And you maybe don't want to approach it in that way, but you might want to remind them that when the Constitution was being drafted in the Federalist Papers, the authors of the Federalist knew very well that they were defying the wisdom of the ancients. The ancients had said, you cannot have a republic in an extended territory with a heterogeneous population. Impossible. It always degenerates into despotism. And so they said, but we have figured it out. We have this ingenious design for government that will enable us. But there's this very worrisome passage, Madison, Federalist 55, toward the end of Federalist 55, where Madison says, I'm convinced that the present genius of the United States is sufficient to carry this extra burden. But, says he, what will happen as the country expands and the population expands? I do not say. That would require a prophetic spirit to declare. So I think it sobers people maybe when they realize that that design that we have is unique in the world and that it's fragile, and you have to think about what holds it up. And as you know, there's this great debate whether liberalism, liberal democracy can itself generate the qualities. And that's the place, I think, where you might be able to get people's attention. And then I think the other point that you want to make is that our country is better and richer for its religious diversity. We, after all, have been long held up by Benedict, especially as an example to the world where we achieved a way of many different religions and no religions, not only coexisting, but flourishing. And you might want to ask people if that's maybe something holding on to. And then finally, I think you could just a straight out appeal to government shouldn't be telling people to violate their deepest beliefs, except for a very good reason.
So read more Tocqueville. You can't go wrong with that. All right, questions from you all. Direct them at me and I'll direct them to our guest. And since there are law students here, I can call them.
Well, I could ask you a question, Richard.
That's not about this. Nobody came here to hear me, man.
I really do have.
Dan, go ahead.
Maybe I can form this into a question. I wonder if you could say another word about Roosevelt and the FDR book. It seemed like he was operating in a sort of like dualist way. The government can provide sort of physical needs, but there are still spiritual needs that only private associations, there's sort of personal needs that only private associations and religious groups can provide. And that seems to me to sort of, that and combined with this appeal to, well, religious organizations, sort of smaller scale social communities provide good citizens for the whole state. That seems to get things reversed and put religious association, put religion at the service of the state, not vice versa. And those things combined seem to me to sort of give up the game. When you have, when you know, the opponents are saying, like, no, in fact, people don't have spiritual needs, at least not spiritual in the sense that religious people need that. They sort of have the sort of spiritual needs that therapists exist, but not the sort of needs that the church exists. Yes, I wonder if you can say a little about that. If really, yeah, what if maybe it's less tractable debate than
Okay, I think the strongest argument against the idea of relying on civil society to take care of education, healthcare, et cetera, with government aid, this is what many of my friends say, is, well, you take the king's penny, you dance to the king's tune. And so I think that was not Roosevelt's vision. Roosevelt's vision was true subsidiarity. It was the government has stayed out low these many years. But now that we have an economic crisis, the federal government will step in. But after this crisis is over, it will be up to these first line providers of all those things, and government will not be funding them. But, you know, the train left the station, obviously, but there's still, as you know, John Stuart Mill, great apostle of liberty, you don't want government running everything, not only because of, well, can I give some more quotes from Roosevelt? This is the unknown Franklin Roosevelt that I'm trying to bring back. He says to Congress, now when you do this, you've got to be careful how you do it, because the wrong kind of aid can be, these are his words, a destructive narcotic, and it will damage the very foundations of our government. So, you know, I find that many, if you mention New Deal or Roosevelt to some people, they're kind of allergic, but you know, his vision is sometimes used as, his versions of his vision are sometimes used to justify programs that were very far from the way he saw things.
Thank you, Professor Glendon, so much for coming and for speaking to us. We really appreciate it. You mentioned the book Vanishing Right to Life, which discusses the culture shift on the cheapening of human dignity. And obviously, since like the past 60 years of that decision, we've seen it really progress. So how would you advise the younger generation like myself, especially those who are interested in law, to kind of stop and reroute that culture shifting that's continuing to, you know, infiltrate the minds of like the younger generation, and get it back to the ways in which we see that respect for human dignity, especially when you have such the molding of education that you mentioned earlier today? How do you kind of fight that on such a fast train?
So let me see if I understand your question. So if we feel that we have a mission to try to do what we can to transform the culture, what do we do? So we're talking about, you know, one of the most important and the hardest things we do in life is try to discern what we are called to do. And that's a lifelong proposition. But the fact that you're asking the question is already the big first step.
Another point just to follow on the questioners is, again, with your image of analogizing concern for social ecology to environmental concerns and so on, it does appear that younger people are focused pretty closely on the sort of long-term risks of inadequate stewardship of the natural environment. And I suppose one way to think of this question might be how to channel that appreciation that younger people have for the way in which they depend on the natural environment, to make them also appreciate the way they might depend on this human ecology that you've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that is what Popes John Paul II and Francis were trying to encourage people to do. Maybe just making analogies as they did from how we can see long-term harms, unintended consequences in the context of nature. John Paul II says even more important to start thinking that way when we're thinking about our social environment. But neither one of them developed that. I mean, they just sort of threw it out there. But I think that in a young population that is very attuned to environmental conservation, protection, that might be a good analogy, good place to start. You know, I told you that little story about the legal mind that can only focus on one thing. I think we all tend to be present-minded. It's very hard to get people to think about long-term consequences, probabilities, possibilities, how to make those distinctions. But I think that it's time, I mean, lawyers have just got to stop thinking about the little hole under the white sheet and just focusing on the one little problem.
Professor Munoz.
Thank you, Professor Glendon. It's a wonderful lecture. I wonder if you could comment on the FDR quote about, that you started with, about him saying that these measures undertaken by the federal government are temporary and that concern for welfare and morals of the people will return back to the state level or local level and voluntary association. When it's interesting to see that, my reaction was that was hopelessly naive. And once you start doing these things at the federal level, you're never going to be able to stop them. And I'm wondering if you might comment on that. Was that realistic? Is that what we can make of FDR, this portrait of FDR that seems better than what actually happened?
Yeah, I don't think he was naive. I think that he didn't. This is another problem with present-mindedness. You're in an emergency, you're in a crisis, and you're not going to worry too much in the crisis about how this might play out. But he had so many, he was thinking enough so that he had warnings to Congress. And we have a great word in Catholic social thought, subsidiarity. Now, I thought where you were going, Professor Munoz, was the big problem of the fact that, especially in that time in the history of the United States, there was another way the federal government had to get involved, and that there was great inequality and discrimination involving social services and everything else. So there's this other very difficult tightrope to walk. You want to implement the principle of subsidiarity because there are real dangers to the very structure of our government if any one of the checks and balances gets way out of proportion. So you got to keep that in mind, but you also have the fact that we were living under, in many states, under legal segregation. So I think he was just, now, I am not naive about Franklin Roosevelt. If you read any biographies of Roosevelt, he was a devious character. And you know, when you read his statements, you have to sift out where does he really speak from the heart, and where is he for the moment saying, well, maybe just budge a little here and there. I mean, this is not unknown in the area of politics. But I think the question you raise and the question about segregation and race that I raised mean that subsidiarity in a country like ours requires a lot of very fine, the skill, the art of the statesperson. You know, not the scalpel, not the sledgehammer.
It seems like one of the common objections to that is that the expression of conscious rights is a form of art.
I'm not.
So I guess my question is, how would you be responding to that? Beyond just mere expression of conscious rights, what that
I don't know if everybody heard.
I didn't.
I'll like it. So the question is, you lifted up the importance in this debate of respecting the fact that people are acting out of religious conscience, or the institutions are acting out of religious conscience, such as Catholic Social Services. But what do you say to those who would respond by saying, look, what you're calling your exercise of conscience is actually wronging or harming me, and why should the wrongs done to me be subordinated to your actions of conscience?
Yeah. What I suggested was that most of these situations can be worked out. This is my guess. Looking at conflicts between two important goods, non-discrimination, religious freedom, there's usually a way, and we have lots of examples in various legal systems, usually a way to work that out so as to accommodate as much as possible of the good that each, we're a big heterogeneous country and we have to learn to live with, to tolerate, and get along with your neighbor, not crush your neighbor, to use Marx. So I think in a way, you probably not be surprised to hear me say this. I think the use of rights language has not been helpful here, because the language of rights does many good things, as all of us know, and we're all for it, giving a voice to voices that wouldn't be heard. But the language of rights is not particularly well suited to resolving complex social problems or profound moral controversies. And I think by shooting so many of those controversies into the courts, and the courts being willing to fiddle a little with their constitutional mandate in order to accept them, we've had a kind of spiral of undesirable consequences. We tend to shut down the potential of bargaining, education, persuasion, resolving things by voting. And if you make a mistake, you can vote again rather than going to another bad consequence, which is giving so much to the court that you politicize the court itself, poison the process of judicial nominations, and ultimately exacerbate the divisions that are already present in our society. So I think that we have to blame, we really have a kind of, our system of checks and balances and separation of powers is not in top condition. I guess I would put it that way. And it just seems as though many of these so-called conflicts, they are conflicts, but there are tensions between freedom and equality that we have to live with forever. There are tensions between majority rule and individual rights we have to live with forever. Better not to have the all or nothing decision. You lose and we'll treat you like the Germans and the Japanese after World War II. Actually, the Germans and the Japanese were treated pretty well after World War II, considering. But
so the law students in the room will know that I'm not the biggest fan of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. But he did say something that I think is worth taking to heart, and that is that it is possible to live greatly in the law, and you have.
Oh.
So thank you for being here. Thank you for your witness, for your inspiration, and for launching this series, which honors our friends, the Hassons and Charlie Rice. And everybody, please join me if you would in welcoming.